Okay. Welcome everyone to our Wednesday seminar just before our spring break. And today we are going to have a presentation by Joana called Atlantic Rock Art, a Global Worldview. Joana, she's from Historic Environment Scotland and has also recently produced a BAR called Design and Connectivity, The Case of Atlantic Rock Art, Volume 1, in their new series of prehistoric art. And today will be a presentation based largely on this book. So if you are interested in the book, welcome, and hopefully this will be a great preview for you. And there, I'm sure, will be details afterwards where you can find the BAR. So, Joana, would you like to take over?
Yeah, well, thanks, Jen. First of all, thanks for inviting me. It's really nice, and thanks for everyone who's attending. I know that this is a difficult kind of period, transitioning into holiday and stuff, last day of term, all that stuff. So my name's Joana. I'm currently working for or with Scotland's Rock Art Project with Historic Environment Scotland. But today my talk will be about my previous project, so what I did before, which was essentially my PhD, which I completed a few years ago at the University of Southampton, and it was funded by the Portuguese Foundation for Science and Technology, which is where I am from, Portugal. So I will start by, can you see that? Has the slide changed? Hopefully it has. So I will just start by giving you a very brief overview of what Atlantic rock art is. So the term was essentially used initially by Owen McQuaid. So he was an Irish researcher, and in the 1950s he was studying the rock art of Ireland and Galicia in northwest Spain, and they share a lot of similarities. And so he started using this term Atlantic to create this comparison between the two regions. So the term was later used and mostly popularized by Richard Bradley, who, as you may know, has dedicated quite a lot of his time studying what we now call Atlantic rock art, which and kind of focusing on study areas in Portugal, Spain, Ireland, Scotland, and England. So what we know, or how Atlantic art is usually characterized, it's best known for its circular motifs. So we tend to talk about cup and ring marks, cup marks, which are just the little hollows on their own, spirals, some wavy grooves. And the rock art was essentially carved, so we don't know any examples of paintings until now. Or rather, we've never found any examples of paintings. And it's essentially geometric and abstract. And carved on flat horizontal outcrops and boulders in the landscape. And they tend to be quite flush with the ground in general. So this is essentially an open air tradition, clearly associated with the landscape. And there's been a lot of discussion about what it was for, why they were created there. And Bradley, I will talk about this a little bit later, but he introduced this idea of landscape archaeology and this relationship between the rock art and the landscape, which then led to several ideas of it being associated with natural routeways, watercourses, grazing areas, or other economic areas that were essentially important for the people who were creating them. So in terms of geographical distribution, I've mentioned before that we can find it in a number of countries across the Atlantic facade. So essentially we have the same type of motifs carved on similar types of rocks and open air landscapes in Portugal, in the north of Portugal, in the northwest of Spain, so essentially in the region of Galicia, in Ireland, in Scotland, and also in England, particularly in the northwest, but we now have other examples that are coming up in other parts of the country. So looking at the iconography in a little bit more detail, I mentioned the cup marks and the cup and rings, but there are other variations also we call penannular. So they're essentially gapped rings, usually with a central cup mark and a line or radial coming through the gap. We have some spirals. Spirals are considered to be part of Atlantic art, but to be honest, they're not that common. In Iberia, we have labyrinths, and we have animals and human figures and weapons and other sorts of motifs like idols that we don't really find in any of the other regions. We have also rosettes, which we can find in most of the regions, although they are not incredibly common. We have lots of wavy lines, and so these are essentially the motifs that compose the iconography of Atlantic rock art. So chronology is a problem because we don't have a very good grasp of chronology for rock art. We don't have, in this case, pigments to date. We don't have good context or, sealed rock art in stratigraphic context. We don't have any of that at the moment. And as you may imagine, when the rock art was found initially, nobody really knew what they were looking at. And so there was a lot of speculation. But Atlantic rock art has been thought to be a practice of the Bronze Age for quite a long time, and most of the 20th century, that's what people believed it to be, essentially because there are carved blocks found in Bronze Age funerary monuments, and also because in Iberia you have these very detailed weapons carved alongside cup and rings, or not far from these cup and ring motifs and other circular iconography, and they have very specific so we know about kind of material counterparts of these representations that were found in excavations. And also there are some examples of the artifacts themselves being found in crevices of carved rocks. So essentially, for a very long time, Atlantic rock art was thought to be part of this, of the Bronze Age. And equally, for a very long time, it was said that Atlantic rock art was produced until the Iron Age, because then we find some carved blocks within Iron Age settlements. We have examples of that in Spain and Portugal, and also here in Britain. So we have one here in Traprain-Law, where we see some circular motifs that were kind of found during an excavation. Recently, however, this idea started to change. So in the 2000s, there were more excavations being carried out around rock art, although we do have the example of the Ladies Long Barrow excavation in 1970s, where the first carved block with cup marks was found in context, and it was dated to 3280 BC. But yeah, so the excavations at Torvlaren in Kilmartin, and also Ben Lors in Loch Tay, and Hunter Hugh Crags in Northumberland have all produced Neolithic radiocarbon dates, as well as other types of structures and artifacts that seem to corroborate this idea that Atlantic art actually began being used, or was started being produced a little bit earlier in the Neolithic. In Ireland, we have the great work of Blaise O'Connor, who used this interdisciplinary methodology, combining the analysis of rock art, but also the analysis of the contexts, geophysics, excavations, and she concludes that Atlantic rock art, or at least the rock art in the area that she was studying, was a product of the Middle Neolithic, and it was actually associated with a lot more mundane kind of activities. The reassessment of all data and reports of historical excavations have also been raising some questions, and also producing new kind of evidence for this. We also have that on the bottom of the screen. We also have that carved rock with a cup and ring that was found in an excavation at the Ness of Brodgar, which is definitely of Neolithic chronology. And although we don't really have a lot of open air rock art in Orkney, strangely enough, it does seem that it does suggest that at least the design was there, the design was being used at that point. So the first publications about Atlantic rock art in general date to the 19th century, but there are some references of it in the 18th century in Spain. And the early studies were mostly interested in finding out what the symbols meant, the chronology, obviously, what was the distribution of the rock art, and they were heavily based on typological tables that were essentially describing the shapes and the styles of the motifs endlessly. So we have lots of publications that are essentially tables and tables of motifs. And this lasted for quite a long time. And then, oops, the slide didn't change. And then we have the emergence of processual archaeology, which obviously brought changes to archaeology in general, but also to rock art, although at a slower pace, and introduced more sophisticated interpretations, which were borrowed from other disciplines, namely anthropological theory. So this is where we have Richard Bradley coming in, and his work was really a turning point in terms of the way that Atlantic rock art was being assessed at the time. So his work was heavily influenced by social anthropology, but also structuralism. And he was the one who introduced the concept of landscape archaeology in the study of Atlantic rock art specifically, which also had repercussions for other types of rock art studied elsewhere, and of other chronologies as well. So by means of this structuralist-based methodology that he brought in, he defined these binary oppositions and explore the relationship between the location of simple and complex motifs and panels in relation to the landscape and social activities that were divided into upland versus lowland, hunting versus agriculture, mobile versus sedentary, grazing versus home-based, and so on. And he concluded that the carvings were often depicted in prominent settings with extensive views over, valley routeways and coastlines, and that the signs were used to mark the movement of people through the landscape, and were produced by these communities who had this seasonal pastoral economy. So from this point onwards, context for rock art became key, and there were many other studies developed after this, looking at the relationship between rock art and landscape, including a wider temporal and spatial scale of analysis and a dialectical perspective aiming at contextualizing rock art in terms of its social and cultural role, which is a really big challenge, I can tell you. So Bradley really launched an irreversible turn in terms of rock art studies, and he tried to incorporate people's perception and the experience of prehistoric landscape as people moved through it. So you can see on the slide, there's an example of Purcell, Avril Purcell, who was working on rock art more or less at the same time as Bradley, but in Ireland, and who was also looking at some of these landscape variables. And also O'Connor, Blaise O'Connor, who also developed a study which included this landscape perspective, with very interesting results indeed. And so as a result, the 21st century is telling us a very different tale about the study of Atlantic rock art. And so this leads us to my research. And I was essentially interested in, one, addressing the character of Atlantic rock art and the formal similarities shared across these regions in the Atlantic, addressing the regional deviations, comparing regional data and enabling this discussion about interregional contact, and also assessing the implications of connectivity for Atlantic rock art. In my previous research, I had also gone down the line of landscape archaeology, and I thought this was the path that made more sense to me. However, I became very interested in this idea of similarities and differences and repetition. And in fact, the similarities of Atlantic rock art go beyond the motif designs. They include other elements that I've mentioned, like the landscape location, the type of rocks that were selected to depict the images, even the human experiences and the skills that people needed to reproduce the rock art, and also the events and actions that would lead to the making of the motifs. And although at a large scale, Atlantic rock art seems to be really similar, so we can look at Iberia and whatever, and it all seems very similar. When we start really looking deeply into the rock art of each region, there are differences, but they're very difficult to identify. So I started thinking about these ideas of similarity and difference, and I think that these are concepts that or expressions that we often use in archaeology, but we don't really discuss them in much detail. And thinking about Atlantic rock art, it is essentially a repetition of motifs carved in a very specific way in very specific places. And so I thought that perhaps if I'd look at the work of Deleuze and his concepts of similarity and repetition and differentiation, it could perhaps help me to think about how to tackle this, because in my mind, it was I wasn't quite sure how I would effectively compare regions that essentially had evidence that was the same. So I had cup and rings in one side, cup and rings in the other. I had a landscape location that was similar everywhere. So how was I going to tackle and establish the similarities and the differences between these regions? So according to the law, similarities can be polysemic. And this is an idea that I thought fits quite well with Atlantic art because of the affinities between the regions, going beyond this iconography and including all the other variables like the rock median, the landscape, and so on. Also, similarities can result from repetition, but they're not necessarily a physical reproduction of the object. On the contrary, Deleuze says the repetition is in the origin of new things, being more a case of coexistence and not succession. And the mechanism of repetition would then promote creativity and transformation. And in this context, it seemed to me that although Atlantic rock art was similar, when copied, it could have been through a process of differentiation, promoting variation more than identity and similarity. And so the symbols could have been repeated extensively in how many different landscapes of these different regions, but the meanings could be very different depending on the factors that were underpinning their creation. And so how was I going to approach this similarity and this difference and this repetition, bearing these ideas in mind? So I'm supposed to change. Here we go again. So the other thing is, I thought that to understand the nature of Atlantic rock art and to be able to compare it, I needed to establish what exactly I was dealing with. And so similarities are often discussed under the concepts of style or traditions, and there are specific discussions about these concepts applied to this type of rock art. And personally, I didn't find either of these concepts particularly useful on their own for what I was looking at. On one hand, we have style, which is an inheritance of cultural history. It's very often applied to rock art studies without really looking into any original context, and is used to identify specific, iconographic assemblages, or refer to a region or culture or people, and even establish timescales. But it's clear that stylistic similarities do not equate chronological equivalence, and so to establish these direct relationships is really risky, and there have been circumstances in the past where this was done, and it really wasn't very useful. As for traditions, the concept was introduced as a reaction against the limitations of the notion of style, and as a way to explain the prevalence of material culture. It can be useful. It implies an inheritance and a historical continuity involving the transmission of ideas and techniques, but the perspective attributes a passive role to human agents who are receivers of this package of knowledge. And I thought that that could be a limitation as well. And I needed something that would allow me to create this relationship between all the components that I was seeing that that are part of this concept of Atlantic rock art. And so, moving on, I thought that the idea of assemblage, according to assemblage theory, was essentially what described Atlantic rock art more usefully to me, because it referred to a group of entities that were acting together, and it enabled me to characterize the rock art as a group of heterogeneous and dynamic components that were all important to this one whole, but that could also be studied in isolation. And I could also, with this concept, with this idea of Atlantic rock art as an assemblage, I could also use aspects of style and tradition that are useful for me. So from style, I could adopt the description of the shapes, for instance, and the motifs, and the way that the iconography was traditionally studied through typologies even. And from tradition, I could also include the interaction of the motifs and the know-how of how to produce it, and this idea of transmitting the rock art. So in this assemblage, all the scales of analysis were equally important, and they all have a part to play in the renewed concept of Atlantic rock art that I will be discussing later on with you. So there was this essentially Atlantic rock art is represented here as a dynamic relationship between these entities, such as the motifs, the landscape locations, the landscape affordances as well, the carving techniques, amongst other physical features, but also intangible components such as the technical behaviors, choice, decisions, decision-making, preferences, ideologies and beliefs that obviously we don't really have a very good grasp of, that were underpinning the creation of repetition of the rock art. But it could also include the interaction with a modern passerby that finds these strange carvings for the first time on a rock at some point during the 21st century. So something relational and flexible. And so in practical terms, this translated into a robust platform for comparison based on a multi-scalar methodology that I came up with, which essentially ignored the modern administrative borders, which was one of my great concerns, because obviously we didn't have any of these divisions during prehistory. And so despite the stigma of typologies, I created a categorical scheme based on these three different scales of analysis, looking at different components of the rock art, and obviously I had to create some typological classifications as well. And so at a small scale, which I call the graphic scale, I was focusing on the motifs and the small details of the motifs, so investigating so these aspects, the motifs in situ, but also through digital recordings or 3D models that were produced with photogrammetry and reflectance transformation imaging. And these enabled the identification of very, very fine details and other important features, such as superimpositions in the rock art, which were previously thought to be absent. So at a medium scale of analysis, the sensory scale, I was focusing on the rock medium, so the type of rock that was chosen and was selected to carve, and the way that the motifs were interacting with it. So not only the rock type and its characteristics, but also the use of natural elements such as fissures and hollows and solution holes to form the motifs, the spatial organization of the images on the rock surface, how the designs were structured, and so on. And finally, at the large scale, the environmental scale, I was looking at obviously the wider landscape, which was clearly important for the rock art, considering that the rock art is effectively effectively fixed points initially on the landscape. And so I was moving away from this traditional and static approach to the motifs only. I was also moving away from the overemphasis on the landscape, which was obviously originated from this stigma of typological approaches. Nobody was really looking at the motifs in detail anymore. And I was bringing it all together and also including this human component through the assessment of decision making and creation behavior and so on. It's worth noting that I didn't quite invent the wheel here because I used part of Blaise O'Connor's classification scheme in order to make comparable data sets. And so I just developed it into what the needs of my research, because I was obviously looking at 5 different countries, and there were other things that I had to expand on the classification scheme. So I then decided to which areas I was going to study, and I kind of selected specific criteria to define my case studies so that all my areas would be comparable. And I ended up with the Mackers Peninsula in southwest Scotland, that's Dumfries and Galloway, Rombauld's Moor in Yorkshire, so northeast England, Iver Peninsula in southwest Ireland and County Kerry, that is Barbanza Peninsula in Galicia in Spain, and Montefado in the north of Portugal. And I need to change slides again. Yeah. So I'm just going briefly to tell you about each of the variants that I was looking at. And so at a small scale, I was looking at things like the type of depiction, which essentially assessed the way in which the motifs were carved on the rocks and the relationship with the surface's microtopography. And so we had a planar style, where the motifs were largely unresponsive to the rock surface and essentially had a 2-dimensional character. A plastic style where the motifs were slightly more responsive and began to incorporate certain natural features such as fissures and solution holes into the compositions. And then we have the 3D style where the motifs completely embrace the microtopography of the rock, resulting in 3D images often carved with deep grooves and more complex carving techniques. And then the motif classification category is the most complex one that I have in the scheme, and because of the 3D models were so detailed, I was able to identify many details, some of them quite subtle, that compose the carved motifs, and so I was able to come up with this really complex and huge variation of motifs. So the detailed analysis of these motifs revealed, for instance, that well-known cup and rings, for instance, were not simply cup marks surrounded by circles, but they were often designed with a number of subtleties. So we had some of them that were, gapped on one end. Others had extended legs. Some of them were had converging ends. So there's a huge variation in just the cup and ring variant, and a lot of these were actually repeated in more than one case study, in more than one region. So this category was really important in the identification of similarities and differences between the study areas, and this began to shed some light on the regional personalities of the rock art. Equally, again, thanks to the high resolution 3D models, I was able to identify different types of carving techniques. They're all based on pecking, of course, or most of them, but there are also variations in the way that the pecking was produced, and combinations with other techniques as well. And as with the motifs, some of these carving techniques were also found simultaneously in more than one region. So moving on to the next scale of analysis, we're now on the sensorial scale. So looking at the media type, essentially the rocks that were where the carvings were produced. And typically Atlantic rock art is known for being created on flat and flush with the ground boulders and outcrops in the open landscape, which is indeed the great majority of the cases. But there are variations, with some carvings being done on sloped surfaces, some of them on small shelters, and in Scotland even, you have the unique example of Ballochmyle, where you have this massive wall, completely vertical wall carved with lots of cup and ring motifs. In terms of the motif range, what I was looking here was at the frequency of different motifs depicted in each panel. So whether a rock had one dominant motif, or if there were 2 to 4 motifs, different types of motifs carved, or more than that. And essentially, Atlantic art is really quite monothematic. And then the compositional subclasses was looking at the spatial organization and the distribution of the carvings on the rock surface, and classifying the panels into 7 different variants from rocks carved with one single motif. And this is not about the frequency, but the actual number of motifs carved on the rocks. To very dense compositions, irregular patterns, or distributions that could be organized around one or more prominent motif. It does seem, we do have this idea that there are lots of very sophisticated carvings in Atlantic art, because we have, I guess, we're all familiar with rocks like Achnabrek in Kilmartin, or other examples such as that. But effectively, the large majority of carvings are very simple. They have very simple arrangements of 1 to 2 motifs, and this tendency had already been noted by other researchers, including Richard Bradley, and certainly this study confirmed that. Finally, at this sensorial scale, one of my favorite parts, or one of the things that I find more interesting about the rock art, is effectively this connection with the natural features of the rocks. And previous research from Bradley, Andy Jones, Blaise O'Connor, and myself, we've all noted that Atlantic rock art is quite reactive to the natural features of the rocks. And this is a feature that became increasingly more obvious the more I was looking into the rock art in detail. In fact, it is an integral part of the tradition. And on occasion, it's almost as if we don't really know where natural ends and where the motif, the made motif starts. And so I created a series of variants, which were in the previous slide, to assess this relationship and the general behavior of the motifs on the rocks. So looking at the interplay between motifs and fissures, for example, some of them being used as radials for cup and rings, or being used to organize compositions, dividing or enclosing motifs, where we have solution holes or other natural hollows that were used to transformed into cup marks. We have natural convexities that may be enclosed by motifs, or other natural features that are sometimes enhanced through carving. So in the picture in the middle, that's Badger Rock in Yorkshire, in Rumbold's Moor, and you can actually see that long line in the middle, it was probably a natural feature that was all pegged on the inside. So this relationship is also extended to the edge of the panels that are often an integral part of the compositions, and they provide a limit to the workspace, but also an intentional break to the motifs, or a contour to the compositions. The structural variants assess the relationships and the interaction between the motifs themselves. So previously we were looking at the relationships with the microtopography, and now we're looking at the motifs within themselves. There are, in many instances, the sense of linearity, so they were kind of carved in with this sense of lines. There are convergences of motifs in the compositions. Very often, the motifs are connected through very intricate lines, networks of lines. So we have lots of little wavy lines with cup and rings at the end, for instance, or cup marks. And more importantly, superimpositions. I think I mentioned this before. They were initially thought to be completely absent, but actually they're not. They are they're more common than what we thought. And also, no, I think that's it. Sorry. Right. So finally, the environmental scale is looking at the landscape, and the surrounding of the rock art, and I did this at 2 levels. So one, the immediate environs of the rock art, which included the smaller groups of rocks, and then the wider perspective that of the study areas as a whole, so the peninsulas, the plateau, the mountains. And it aimed to answer questions about the accessibility of the carved rocks and interrogate their intervisibility and view sheds, the relationships with routeways, the prominence of panels, and other variables that had been considered to be important in the location of Atlantic rock art. And this assessment was carried out with GIS in part to be used as a system to enable a cross-reference of multiple variables on site distribution and to engage with the creation and the manipulation and also the simulation of space. So these analyses determine the affordances of the terrain in which the rock art was located. The same analysis and considerations were then replicated during fieldwork through a sensorial approach of the landscape to avoid a completely static character to the approach, and also to capture some human behavior, which is missing in the computational analysis, because GIS results from an abstraction of space and does not necessarily represent effectively the experience of the landscape, particularly when we consider that our body is so essential to understand our surrounding world. And so I thought that this was a big limitation, and also the fact that the modeling depends incredibly on the accuracy of the base maps, and of course the landscapes that we have in our current base maps are not necessarily the ones that we had at the time the carvings were produced. And there were things that, you know, I could not include, like vegetations, because we don't have enough environmental studies, or, you know, it's difficult to model atmospheric conditions and so on. So, of course, personal observations are incredibly subjective due to body cultural specific biases, but atmospheric and climatic circumstances really affect the way that we perceive the landscape. And in this case, with the rock art, is really, really notorious. And in many occasions during field work, the climatic conditions that we were working under were a great obstacle to the appreciation of the landscape, especially when we were thinking about visibility studies, for instance. So we had constant mist and rain. This is Ireland mostly, but there was lots of mist and rain. Having said that, we did have a lot of rain in Spain as well. And these would really reduce our perception over the rocks and the landscape in general, and condition our approach. And so I started thinking about how this would be kind of how I could incorporate these sensations into the approach as well, because they would obviously be, you know, have to be had implications in the way that people in the past were experiencing the rock art as well. Also, sounds were really important, whether during storms or not. There were lots of areas with water courses or by the sea, and the sounds were really, really, really impressive. And so I ended up adopting this perspective that falls within what Stuart Eaves called embodied GIS, which was a compromise between the two approaches. So this takes me to this idea of a revision of Atlantic rock art. So what does this all tell us about Atlantic art? And in general, there is this coherent idea of rock art across the Atlantic seaboard, but there are local and regional variations as well. So we only have carved motifs. In general, the carvings are very simple. So the motifs are often carved in small and conspicuous rocks. We have a very small number of motifs carved on any one surface, with very few exceptions. There's a low frequency of carved motifs per rock. The complex panels are quite rare, but there are always one or two near a group of or within a cluster of carved rocks. Also, the motifs are relatively standardized despite the regional preferences, which are obviously more striking in Iberia with the introduction of animals and weapons and other figurative motifs. There is a lot of variation in the making of the motifs. Some very specialized details were identified and repeated in all of these study areas, and I mentioned some. So we had the gapped and complete combinations of circles, converging ends on the rings or conjoined ends. And also this idea that motifs are not static, but they take specific positions on the workspace and interact with each other as well as with the rock surface. There are preferences in the articulation of some motifs with each other, and also the incorporation and the transformation of natural features is effectively an intrinsic characteristic of Atlantic art. And in fact, this may well be one of the essential criteria to select the rocks to carve if the artist needed specific natural features to create their motifs and their compositions. So we confirmed that there are superimpositions and converging motifs, and also erased motifs, which had only been previously discussed for Irish megalithic art, but I identified a few cases of these in Ireland. They look like pegged out images, but I think that they were deliberate. And we also found some in Iberia and in Scotland, and we keep finding them in Scotland now with the project that I'm working with at the moment. So also the rocks are generally located in areas that would be suitable for everyday life, although there are a lot of them that are spatially associated with funerary monuments, but obviously we don't really understand their relationship very well at the moment. Given the size of the rocks and the fact that they were often flush with the ground and possibly covered by vegetation, at least seasonally, and considering the quick weathering of the grooves and the role of atmospheric conditions, visibility does not seem to be that all-important feature of Atlantic rock art location that has been written about so much. And also, although Atlantic rock art is located in the landscape and is accessible, presumably, at least spatially, it seems to be quite private and very hidden. And I'm really running out of time, and I had so much more to say. So I'm just going to move on to this idea of cultural transmission. Well, actually, I'm going to just move back a second, because also what started to emerge was that there was this group of characteristics that were possibly traveled in an initial phase and were possibly taken to the different places in Atlantic Europe. And then the tradition itself started developing locally, probably due to different preferences or specific, values and beliefs, and that were intrinsic to the people that were adopting this rock art. But there does seem to be this kind of flat understanding of what Atlantic rock art was, how to use it, how to make it, that was passed on, and people did adopt it, but then develop their own ideas of it. And this is why I had some ideas on cultural transmission that I am going to pass on. I'm going to have to move on. But just to say that the very fine details that I was able to identify repeated in all these different regions really do not allow to think about just a simple kind of copy of the rock art. It had to have been taught intentionally, specifically because it is repeated in such detail that just the simple copy would not produce the same effect. And so we see rock art in this kind of global world of networks of exchange that we know existed during the Neolithic, where we have people and animals and ideas traveling long distances. And so the hypothesis was that that core group of characteristics was transmitted through networks of connectivity and then evolved locally, as I said. I then explore this with with network analysis, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to move on. But in the end, I had some really interesting results with the social network analysis, because essentially it kind of confirmed the hypotheses, because I used this algorithm that would essentially investigate or kind of consider the relationships or the stronger relationships between every site, and essentially it came up with these three groups, these three communities, and you can see that we have very strong relationships between England and Ireland here. We have Scotland on its own. We have Portugal and Spain here completely glued together. Obviously, they're very kind of close together geographically anyway. But these differences or these very strong personalities that I was able to identify with this network science approach were in spite of all the similarities that had been also previously identified. So if you look at this map, for instance, you can see that they're all very closely together. I had about 260 variants, and you can see that they're all kind of they share very high numbers of these variables. So just to conclude, and I'm really finishing now that I kind of skipped a lot of it. The other thing that I thought that was really interesting in terms of this approach was that it enabled me to kind of place Atlantic rock in the wider narrative of European prehistory in a way. So Atlantic rock art seems to blend really well with this Neolithic worldview, and this is a period where obviously stone was a really important element of people's lives, and so we see people building these great big monuments, but also kind of transforming hard rock. This had to be difficult, you know, the control over the techniques and the way to, I mean, it's not about how long it would take to carve a cup mark, it's how they would actually implement the designs on the rocks intentionally, you know, the dominating the ideology, the motifs, the carving techniques, everything, and putting it into play. So the idea of modifying something that was so hard and durable could also could represent this highly significant act of appropriation of this natural element, which could be similar to the transformation of the landscape through the construction of monumental architectures. And obviously both share this really kind of close relationship with the landscape. Also, there is this idea of hiding that is somehow implicit in the Neolithic world, and that we can also see emerging here with the Atlantic art. So we have people hiding the funerary monuments by earth mounds. We have carved blocks being hidden in monuments like in Newgrange, or in domestic structures like in the Ness of Brodgar. And following the same logic, it seems clear that Atlantic rock art was also part of this concept of concealment, because as I mentioned, although it was although it was in the landscape, there were all sorts of elements that would make it quite hidden. Not only the fact that, you know, very often the rocks were small, they were not very prominent in the landscape. The grooves would fade very quickly. There are experiments that show that in 2-3 years the grooves are really weathered. Obviously, the vegetation would play a really important role in this in the visibility of the carved rocks, possibly covering it seasonally. And obviously that question of the atmospheric conditions that I mentioned, that would really also impact this idea. And also, finally, Atlantic rock art is also kind of imbued in this idea of transformation, not only physical, but also social and cultural. So we see Atlantic rock art changing with societies. And from the Neolithic to the Bronze Age, it changed its rhythms of making and use, and the perceptions towards it changed as well. So when we see the introduction of metalwork during the Chalcolithic and especially during the early Bronze Age, this may have doomed the importance of stone, and this had a reflection. This was reflected also in the way that people related to the rock art. And so what happens, or what we think it happens, was that it may have stopped being produced in the open, in the landscape, to be then included in these really dark, really kind of secluded funerary chambers. And so, to use Antonia Thomas's metaphor for the art of the Ness of Brodgar, this is essentially when Atlantic rock art as we know it to have been originally was killed. And I think I'm going to finish there because I'm already overrunning. And thank you very much for your attention. And yeah, sorry to have skipped so much, but yeah, I kind of made that classic error of trying to talk too much about stuff, but or trying to put everything in the presentation. Obviously, I didn't have time for that, but anyway.
Well, hopefully we'll have some questions about that, and maybe you can draw out some of your ideas a little bit more in that way. Who would like to kick off with some questions? I will say those photos are amazing.
Thank you.
Hello? Hi, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Oh, okay, hi. I might have a question here. Well, I'm a first year student distance learning, so basically my questions won't be very complicated, I guess. So I'm just asking if this, and maybe you covered that in the part that you skipped, this whole model of interconnectivity and everything, how this is connected, if this is also applicable to other areas where rock art is also found, not only in the Atlantic, but maybe, for example, in Switzerland or in the Alps in general.
Well, I think the methodology you can definitely, it's definitely something that you can reproduce elsewhere. I mean, I used it here because for me it was the way that, because I started thinking about networks of, you know, people kind of moving around and exchange and stuff, and obviously network analysis, that's exactly what it does. So it kind of looks at networks. So you will see it very often being used in things like circulation of, I don't know, it's quite common in like Roman studies for, you know, circulation of people and artifacts and coins and things like that. So it's all about moving around. So you can definitely use it as a methodology. You can definitely use it in other contexts with other types of rock art.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you for that. Does anyone else have a question? You can use the raise hand feature on Teams, or you can type something in the chat and I can ask it on your behalf. Just in case you're shy, maybe.
Okay, well, this actually makes me feel, I feel a bit better about this. Just thought my money isn't vanishing into thin air, it's just sort of.
Jess has asked a question. Did you find any evidence of pigmentation use?
No, well, to be honest, I never really looked for it because essentially, I guess that we just kind of have this idea that the rock art it could have been painted, but it is placed outdoors most of it. So I'm not sure how much pigmentation would have survived. There are some examples of rock art elsewhere that was painted out, you know, in the open, and it did survive. But personally, I've never found any evidence of pigmentation, no.
Okay, thank you for that question. Is there anyone else who wanted to ask a question?
Did I answer your initial question, Jen?
I was actually just going to dig into this because I think it actually will allow you to talk a little bit about the bits that you had to kind of skim over.
Yeah.
So to ask the question, I think it'd be better if I just told you what I know and then ask the question. So with my research, I find this ring and dot motif a lot on long-handled combs. And you'll also see this motif repeated on other types of bone and antler tools in Iron Age. But I went to a museum, now I can't remember where, and I took a picture of it and I literally could not find it. But I found on a 19th century bone tool, and I can't remember where this was found, but I want to say it might have been Turkey, and it was the same ring and dot type motif on bone. And I'm wondering if you have any comment on sort of like the cognitive aspects of different types of decorative elements and the connection with materials or certain types of materials. Because, like, for example, in the Iron Age, there are a few types of materials that get decorated and types of tools that get decorated more so than others. And I'm wondering if there's like some kind of cognitive element relating between decoration motifs and materials that is slightly more persistent or maybe more related to something about humans or humanity. I know this is kind of like a big drawn out question, and it's kind of glossing over some probably very important things like, 2,000 years worth time in between and whatnot. But I wondered if there was anything like there.
Yeah, so one of the questions that I get asked a lot, or the comments that we get a lot, is when people see, say, cup and rings, they're like, oh yeah, I've seen some of those in Alaska, or, I've seen some of those here or there. And I think when it comes to this type of iconography specifically, I think that it's the case of it being really of it being really kind of simple shapes. They're really simple shapes, so they're kind of, I think that people would just possibly come up with them really easily, which is why I put so much emphasis on the context, because context will be really key to understand what you can extract from the rock art. I will not be making comparisons between this type of rock art and what Australia. You have paintings of essentially the same thing in Australia. I'm not sure this is answering your question. However, there is, when it comes to being depicted in later kind of periods, and if we're talking about the same sort of geography, there are cases where there seems to be a continuity of shapes. So, for instance, I studied a site, or a number of sites in Portugal, where a lot of this rock art was preserved despite an Iron Age hill fort having been kind of built really, really close. And the best example is really one of the walls of that Iron Age is made of stone. One of the walls is like a meter away from this massive rock with lots of cup and rings. And obviously, whenever they built that wall, they knew that that was there. They could see it, but they preserved it anyway. And then interestingly, you do get to see in the pottery that is found within the domestic kind of features of that settlement, you do get to see a lot of these sort of cup and ring kind of motifs as well. So it's almost as if they were kind of reproducing shapes that they knew that existed and that they were familiar with from previous periods into their own. They were kind of making them their own. Obviously, it's just the one example, but we do. You're right. I mean, we do get to see them in other things. I mean, we have them in like lots of Viking combs and things like that. It doesn't really address your question. It was a very difficult question, that one was.
Yeah, I'm hoping. Well, I particularly like the word that you used, emulation.
Yeah.
And I think there's definitely something possibly going on with emulation with long-handled combs specifically, because in the Iron Age, you don't often get a lot of similarities of comb decoration styles, or even if you were to look at the assemblage morphologically, they all look the same, but in terms of decoration, they are very individualistic, even if there are common motifs between them. Part of that's down to the natural nature of the material, but I know Helen has looked at a few combs where, for all intents and purposes, they are identical, which, sort of makes you question like this idea if they're, you know, made by the same practitioner, if this is like commonalities within a group that are being expressed by, I mean, emulating one another. I mean, that's a really interesting thought worth pursuing in the future. But yeah, I just didn't want to confine you to like something super specific that you might not know much about. So yeah, complicated question, indeed.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's this, yeah, I mean, we could just sit here talking about the possibilities, like for the next couple of hours. But yeah, I mean, there is definitely that. There is definitely an element of kind of using iconographies that are already known and making them their own, you know, and then, yeah.
Okay, we've got one question from Andrew. Says, please, can you elaborate on your use of what you called embodied GIS?
Yeah, so it's not really my expression, so it's Stuart Eves, and essentially what I make of it is this combination of so in my case, what I did was before going out to the field, I would, you know, I had questions that I wanted to answer, and I did a lot of GIS analysis to explore like visibilities and accessibility and all sorts of things. Also explored patterns of location of the rock art with like aspect analysis and slope and all that sort of stuff. And then during field work, I would do this before going out in field work, and then during field work, I would actually contrast my observations with those analyses, and then I'd reproduce the analysis again with the data that I had kind of collected in the field, if that makes sense. So there are 3 levels of analysis here. One with the data that I had gathered from like bibliography and stuff like that. Another one based on my observations. So I would be kind of assessing what are the view sheds from here, what can I see from here, what is intervisible, and so on. Also, I would be and then I would kind of be replicating, doing all the analysis again afterwards. The other thing is I try to kind of implement a certain humanity into my computational analysis. So for instance, in terms of the view sheds, I had to determine how were they important for me? Because one of the things that the GIS told me before I went out in the field, for instance, was that if I was on one side of the Macas Peninsula, assessing the affordances of the view sheds from a specific point, I could potentially see rocks that were on the other side of the peninsula, like 15 kilometers or so away, which obviously I cannot, you know, but that's what the GIS is telling me. And this I just got a little bit concerned about relying too much on the computer and on these kind of algorithms. And I needed to kind of make it a little bit more human, really. So in terms of visibility, for instance, I looked at Higuchi, who establishes his kind of he studies visibility. He does visibility studies considering different kind of distances to a certain point, taking into account the shadows of a tree, I think it is. So for me, for instance, when I was looking at the view sheds, I then was using data that I kind of extracted from the fields. So I was confirming, I defined my kind of distances to the rock as in, you know, at 10 meters, for instance, can I see the carvings? You know, at 50 meters, can I see the rock? At what distance does the rock become a little bit confusing to be identified? You know, so I was kind of establishing distances according to my real perception of the rock art. You know, so essentially that's what my take on the embodied GIS is, which it is this kind of interplay between the GIS analysis and my observations of the field and also the contrast of the analysis. Because one of the things that I've realized is that sometimes my observations were very different from those of the rock art. You know, it would tell of the GIS. It would tell me, for instance, that some kind of rock was located in a very steep kind of slope, and I was there and I was like, this doesn't feel very steep. Of course not, because half of it I drove there in it, you know, and then I only had to kind of walk a little bit. So there were lots of kind of things to consider, you know. Also, I was looking at accessibility and for in terms of GIS, unless you kind of, obviously there are ways of doing this, but it doesn't really consider a lot of things like all the obstacles that you find in the field, you know. I was looking at kind of isochrones and whatever, and it was like it didn't really take into account all of the field walls and all the gates that I had to jump over, and you know, obstacles like that. So it's kind of a combination of the GIS analysis and this kind of fieldwork experience, which personally I find really important in this case. You know, I think going there and having a feel of the landscape and of the rock art in the landscape was really important, and it really impacted the way that in the end I interpreted everything. You know, I think that it was a much more interesting approach if I had, you know, if I had just kind of stuck to the GIS or something like that. I don't know if that answered your question, Andrew.
Well, if he wanted to hear a little bit more, I'm sure he could get into contact with you. Oh, there he is. And I realize some people have already left, and I was just going to check, but thank you, Andrew, for confirming and asking the question. If there aren't any other questions, I don't see any more in the chat. Yep. Generally well received, so that's always good to hear.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much for coming and presenting your research for us.
Thanks for inviting me. It was really lovely. Now I just wish that we could go down the pub, maybe have a pint. That would be
This has been sitting off camera.
Aha! I only have water.
It's probably better to do that afterwards if you're presenting. But yeah, whenever you're in Leicester next, I'm sure there will be an opportunity after lockdown.
Yeah, hope so.
But yeah, so oh, we have one question. Let's see if we can ask it very quickly. Okay. As you say, oh, so this is from Jess. As you say, there was a lot that was subjective, but did you get the impression that there was something missing in the interpretations that could be where invisible things such as vegetation, weather, and soundscapes could fit?
I'm not sure I understand the question. So when you say something that was missing, right. Yeah, probably there were. I mean, if we think about, for instance, the excavations in Torvlaren and even some of the ones in Perthshire, some of them have platforms associated to the rock art. You know, they found, obviously, knowing whether what people find in the excavations surrounding the rocks is always a little bit difficult to say whether they were essentially contemporary with the carvings or not, but some of them even had in some of these excavations they even found like post holes. So this suggests that there were some sort of structures that lived there at some point. So yeah, there's definitely lots that we probably won't know about. I guess that we at the moment possibly don't consider because we don't know that they existed. Maybe there's an interesting. I saw an interesting presentation once by Aaron Watson, and he was essentially looking at monuments and the light in kind of how the light, the sunlight sheds inside monuments, and he did something really interesting, which was he hung these sort of hides at the entrance, and other sorts of materials, and how people could actually, and how they could have actually had things like that hanging at the entrance, and then control what you see, or how the light was shining, you know, inside the monuments. And I suppose that the same thing could be true with the rock art. You know, they could have control these things in the way that we see them, and the way that they were, you know, used in ways that we don't really know. I mean, there are suggestions that the carvings were located in specific areas, because when the sun kind of hits at a specific hour, you can actually see it, and then it disappears, because most of this rock art is best you know, visualized with raking light. And if you have really low kind of winter daylight, that's the best time to see it, really. So yeah, I think that there are other variables that we could definitely consider that we don't know about. I don't know if that answered your question.
Hopefully she'll say yes.
Yeah.
I think she's still around.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that pretty much goes without saying that, you know, with perishable material culture, like I study textile production, and in the Iron Age, unless you're talking about Yorkshire, there really aren't textiles to examine. And I have to do a lot of pontificating and imagining what textiles would have looked like. And even though with experimentation you can kind of help, it's a real stretch of the imagination to try and think about the things that you don't have archaeological evidence for. So hopefully it is just a matter of time and thinking, you know, more in this abstract sense that.
Yeah, no, that's definitely it. That's definitely it. I mean, sometimes we can't really picture it, and then suddenly there is this amazing find, and it changes completely our perception of, and our kind of idea of things. And I'm kind of smiling because we have in the work that I'm doing now, we just found something really amazing that I'm not allowed to talk about, but stay tuned, because there's big news coming out. So yeah.
Maybe this is a good plug for Twitter. I get a lot of my news from Joanna on Twitter, so maybe go follow her there if you want to hear what this big news is. I'm sure you'll break it there too.
Yep. And you know, and if anyone has any questions of anything that I skipped, or if of anything else, then just, you know, drop me a line or something. I'm happy to answer. Okay. And thanks again for inviting me.
Thanks again for closing out this term before our spring break.
My pleasure.
So thank you very much, and hopefully we will all be able to meet again in person very soon.
Hopefully. Tag December.